Hey, this is Zach from Good Charities Rescue Rebuild program, and this video is the first video of 4 videos to teach you guys what we've learned about chain link fencing. Chain link fencing is the fencing you see behind me here. It's a very common thing to be used at animal shelters, and it's something that can be done a lot of different ways. In this video, we're going to cover some of the basic parts and pieces of a chain link fencing system, and we're going to look at some of the ways where it can be done the wrong way and some of the ways that it can be done the right way for an animal shelter setting. Before we talk about some of the differences in how Rescue Rebuild builds a fence compared to how a chain link fence might be built in a commercial setting or a residential setting, we're going to get into some of the parts and the pieces of that fence. So any chain link fence is going to have posts. That is the very first part of the framework, and behind me we have a corner post here, otherwise known as a terminal post. Anytime you have a direction change in the fence, so like a corner, or perhaps like a 3-way connection where you have a fence coming into another fence, that's going to create a location where you need a terminal post. That's just a fancy way of saying it's a bigger post. It's to carry the weight of the framework and to be structurally stronger than our line posts. And so our line posts are posts that are going to go down the run of fencing in between our terminal posts. Those line posts are going to be a smaller size. And so typically this is going to be a 2.5-inch post, or a 2 3/8 inch post is the actual measurement. And then the line posts are going to be more like an 1 5/8 or an 1 7/8 post. And that covers the vertical part of the framework of a chain link fence. But you also have some horizontal framework. On this, it's going to be our line rail. And so that's what you see behind me on the top of this fence. And this provides some structure in between the posts, and it provides something to attach the chain link fabric to, and that's going to be our next big part. And this is probably the part that you think of as chain link fencing. It's this metal mesh that sits on top of the framework, and this is called our fabric. As we move past some of the bigger pieces, our framework and our fabric, we're going to get into a lot of small pieces of hardware that we refer to as fittings. Fittings is just a general term to describe all of these different pieces that hold all of the framework and the fabric together. So let's start looking at one by one what we've got here. When we look at our fabric connecting to our terminal posts, we've got something called a tension band. This tension band, there's going to be 5 of these on a post, on a 6-foot fence, and they are going to hold on to this tension bar. This bar goes through the end of our fabric, and it kind of distributes some of the load onto the fabric from the post. As that fabric is tensioned, there's going to be quite a bit of force on this bar and on these tension bands, and that's what's holding our chain link to the framework at the ends. As we look at our line rails, there has to be somewhere to connect our line rails to our terminal posts and also to our line posts. Here at the terminal post, we've got something called a brace band. Very similar to a tension band. From the side, it looks almost the same. The difference is that a brace band, the bolt is centrally located on the circle, versus a tension band is actually offset to the side of the framework that the fabric sits. In this situation, the brace band is attached to an end rail cup. This is what holds the end of this line rail tubing to the post. We do ours a little differently, but we'll take a look at that a little later. This is a very common setup that you're going to see in residential and a lot of commercial fencing. As we move down to the bottom of the fence, we've got a cable that runs across the bottom of this fencing. This acts as the tensioning for the bottom of the chain link fabric. However, this is not a system that we're going to use on our fences. So you may see this, but this is not something that we're going to install. As we move down our chain link fabric, we're going to get to our line posts. This line post is in the middle of a run of fabric in between our terminal posts. So this is the smaller 1 5/8 diameter post. On top of this, we have something called a loop cap. This is another really common thing that you're going to see. This is just a cap sitting on top of the post, and then this line rail runs through it. It's not attached, it just has this little loop, and it runs through that. Again, this is something that we are not going to use on our fencing, but it is something you're going to see very commonly. Also on this line rail post, we have these tie wires, or wire ties as our team likes to call them. This is just a piece of aluminum that's wrapped around the post to keep this fabric from coming off of the post. This particular one is barely on here, and this is a residential grade wire tie, and so we're going to use some bigger, beefier ones to make sure this is a lot more sturdy in the future. On our terminal post, we also have a cap, but it's just a nice round cap, and the purpose of that is to keep water from going down in that post and rusting it out prematurely. Let's get into looking at some of the differences between how Rescue Rebuilds installs a chain link fence and how it might otherwise be installed commercially or residentially. One of the things we see most commonly is that the chain link fabric is installed outside of the framework. The reason for this is because it looks nice. Aesthetically, this is the best choice because it kind of hides some of that framework behind it. The problem is when a dog pushes on this from the inside, it comes right off of the framework. Versus if it was on the inside of the framework, if you push, well now it's actually pushing against the framework. And so that's what we want, because repeated stressors against this is going to cause this to fail. We talked about the tensioning cable that runs on the bottom of this fence. What we do instead of that is we run a line rail, just like on the top, but we run it on the bottom. And so it will connect to each post, and it will essentially create a guard from dogs that are trying to push against the bottom of that prevents them from really being able to get at that fence. To accomplish that, we use something called a line rail clamp. And this is what that looks like. It comes in the clamshell in 2 pieces, and it's going to sandwich the line post, and it's going to have 2 carriage bolts that go through here and bolt this together. These line rail clamps are sized depending on the size of the post and depending on the size of the line rail. So this particular one is 1 5/8" by 1 3/8" line rail clamp. We'll get into installing these in the next video, but this is a huge difference that we always add to fences for animal shelters. In addition to using these clamps on the bottom, we're going to go back to the top of the post here, and we're going to actually talk about how we will use the same clamp on top. Now you can see a problem here. This post stops underneath, and so when we set our fencing, we make our posts taller than this, and we will use this same style clamp on here on both sides, and we'll stop and start our line rail clamp. Because this is physically clamping the post, it adds a lot of strength to the structure. It costs a little bit more than a loop cap, and so you don't see a lot of companies using it for that reason. Let's go back to the corner post here, the terminal post. So on this one, we're also going to use a clamp. However, we're going to use a corner clamp. So same situation, this will clamp around here, and then there's an interior corner that will sandwich that line rail clamp to this post. That's going to replace our brace band and our end rail cups that we talked about before. The problem with this setup is that there's nothing actually physically holding this line rail to this cap. So if we take a closer look and I pull on this, you can actually see all this movement. And if I were to pull this hard enough, we can actually dislodge this from this cup, and it's starting to do that now, and it loses all of its strength there. So by using a clamp instead, we're going to have a much stronger connection here that resists any sort of pulling or pushing, and it will always stay connected. Another fitting that you're going to see on a lot of projects is an end rail clamp. So we've got our corner clamps and our line rail clamps we've looked at. In a situation like this, where a line rail just stops at a post, for like where a gate would be, we have an end rail clamp. And so this is the same idea as the others, it's just only has a spot for the line rail to come in on one side, and it's got the larger 2 3/8 opening for the terminal post, just like our corner clamps. So as we talk about our line rail clamps, another thing we have to consider is a situation like this where we have a long run of fencing and another fence is coming into it at a 90-degree angle. We refer to this as a 3-way because there are 3 sections of fence joining. This particular one was not done properly. There is a loop cap and it's kind of scabbed together with pieces that don't work. So our team's going to come in and replace this post with a terminal post that's taller. And once we've done that, we need a way to connect all these line rails to that terminal post. And so we've talked about a corner rail clamp and we've talked about line rail clamps. We're going to actually combine the 2 of them to make the right fitting for this. So in order to do this, you have to take half of a line rail clamp, one of those clamshells, and then you take 2 of the inside parts of a corner clamp and you create a 3-way clamp. So this sits on the outside, and then you have this here and another one here, and that's going to create a 3-way. Unfortunately, we haven't found a company that sells these, and so we have to just buy half as many line rail clamps as we need, and we have to buy a corner rail clamp and not use the outside part of it. It's a little bit of waste, but it gives the best connection to make this super strong. Another thing we see is not enough tension bands. So this fence that's installed here, there are 4 tension bands for the 6-foot fence, which is not bad, and in many cases that's okay. But when we really tension this fabric the way we would like to, it's going to require 5 of these to be able to keep this from bending. You can slightly see this tension bar has actually started to bend in from the tension. And this fence is not tensioned properly, so there's not that much tension on it. While we're talking about tension, this fabric installed on here is a residential grade fabric. It's a very thin gauge material. When we purchase any sort of fabric for this, we purchased 9-gauge fabric. That's a much thicker material. And the reason for that is, even with this tension, I can come in here with my hand and I can actually flex this entire piece of chain link. It's just very weak, and so repeated flexing and moving will cause this chain link to deform, and eventually that's going to mean that dogs get out. This particular fence that was built with residential grade materials is not even a year old, and we're seeing things like this where, because of a lack of bottom rail and this thin gauge chain link fabric, this has completely failed, and a dog could get out through this, and likely has gotten out through this. And so this, along with numerous other locations on this kennel, are going to require replacement of the fabric, addition of bottom rails, and some of these other improvements we've talked about. So now we've covered all of the parts and pieces of a chain link fence system, from the posts to the line rail, the fabric, and all the fittings that tie it together. And we've looked at some of the differences between how Rescue Rebuild would install them and how you might see them installed in other commercial or residential scenarios. Our next video, we're going to cover how to lay out a play yard, how to set our posts, and how to install our line rail. By the time we're done with this video series, you're going to have the confidence to install your very own chain link play yard. If you haven't subscribed to the Greater Good Charities YouTube yet, make sure you do that, because we'll have all 4 videos of this series coming out as soon as we can.